You know what phrase you almost never hear anymore? Go outside and don't come back until dinner. That single sentence defined summer in the 1970s more than anything else. No GPS tracking, no scheduled playdates, no helicopter parenting, just a screen door slamming behind you at 8 in the morning and the freedom to figure out the rest yourself. And here's the thing that might sound strange to anyone under 40. Our parents genuinely had no idea where we were most of the day. They knew the general neighborhood. They knew our friends. But the specifics? Nobody was checking in. Nobody was worried. That wasn't negligence. That was just how America raised kids back then. And somehow, most of us turned out okay. Summer break in the 70s was a different animal entirely. About 10 weeks of unstructured time stretching out in front of you like an open highway. No summer camps filling every hour. No enrichment programs. No travel sports leagues eating up weekends. What we had instead was imagination, a few bucks in our pocket if we were lucky, and an entire neighborhood full of kids who were just as bored and just as free as we were. So what did we actually do with all that time? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I think by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why so many of us look back at those summers with something more than just nostalgia. There was something genuinely different about the way childhood worked back then, and it's worth understanding what we had before it disappeared. Let's start with the great equalizer of 1970s summer, the bicycle. And not just any bicycle. I'm talking about the Schwinn Sting-Ray. When Schwinn introduced the Sting-Ray back in 1963, they didn't know they were creating a cultural icon that would define a generation. But by the early 70s, this bike was everywhere. The banana seat, the ape-hanger handlebars, the low-slung design that made every kid feel like they were riding a chopper motorcycle. The whole design was inspired by the custom motorcycle culture coming out of California, and Schwinn was smart enough to realize that kids wanted to feel cool too. In 1970, a basic Sting-Ray with a coaster brake ran about $57. The 3-speed stick-shift model went for around $76. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $400 today, which tells you these weren't throwaway toys. Families saved up for these bikes, and kids took care of them because they knew how much they meant. The really coveted bikes were the crates. Schwinn launched these in 1968, and by the early 70s, owning an orange crate or an apple crate or the legendary Grey Ghost was the equivalent of having the coolest car on the block. These had the 5-speed stick shift mounted on the frame, a slick rear tire, and spring-loaded front suspension. They looked like tiny dragsters, which was exactly the point. But for the younger kids who weren't quite ready for a two-wheeler, there was the big wheel. Mark's Toys introduced this low-riding plastic tricycle in 1969, and it absolutely dominated the early 70s. That oversized front wheel, the low center of gravity, the ability to spin out and make that incredible skidding sound on concrete. Every kid wanted to be like the children in those commercials, roaring and spinning and winning. The important thing about having a bike in the 70s wasn't just transportation, it was independence. If you had a bike and you proved to your parents you could handle it responsibly, you could go anywhere in the neighborhood. The park 3 blocks away, your friend's house on the other side of the subdivision, the creek where everyone hung out. Your bike was your ticket to the larger world, and the summer stretched out wider because of it. Now, there's a sound that anyone who grew up in the 70s will recognize instantly, and it's not a song on the radio or a television show theme, it's the bells of the Good Humor truck. Good Humor had been selling ice cream from trucks since the 1920s, and by mid-century, their white trucks with uniformed drivers were fixtures of American suburban life. The drivers wore crisp white uniforms with black shoes and red bow ties. They carried coin changers on their belts, and they rang those bells attached to a string above the windshield to announce their arrival. By 1950, Good Humor operated around 2,000 trucks across America, and truck sales accounted for 90% of the company's ice cream business. The fleet followed tight schedules, stopping at the same corners at the same times each day. Families knew exactly when to listen for that jingle. Kids would come running from backyards and front porches, clutching whatever change they'd managed to scrounge up. The menu kept expanding through the 60s. By 1960, each truck carried more than 85 different treats. The strawberry shortcake bar, the chocolate eclair, the toasted almond, the giant king cone. Some of the experimental flavors didn't survive, but the classics became permanent fixtures of American summers. What most people don't realize is that the 70s were actually the beginning of the end for the good humor fleet as we knew it. The 1970s fuel crisis hit them hard. Gas prices spiked, and suddenly running all those trucks wasn't as profitable. Insurance costs climbed because courts started holding ice cream vendors responsible when kids got hit by cars running to or from the trucks. Labor issues mounted. The company was unionized and strikes disrupted operations. By the early 70s, the fleet had shrunk to about 1,200 trucks. Good humor became unprofitable starting in 1968, and after absorbing losses for a decade, they sold off their street vending operations entirely in 1978. The trucks went for between $1,000 and $3,000 each, and many former Good Humor men became independent operators. So, those of us who remember chasing the Good Humor truck in the early to mid-70s, we were actually catching the tail end of an era. We didn't know it at the time, of course. We just knew that bells meant ice cream, and ice cream meant summer. Speaking of things that defined summer in the 70s, let's talk about a completely different kind of entertainment: the drive-in movie theater. Now technically, drive-ins peaked a bit earlier. The golden age was really the late 50s and early 60s, when there were over 4,000 of them spread across the country. But in the 70s, there were still plenty operating, and for families looking for affordable entertainment, they remained a perfect option. The economics made sense. You paid by the car, not by the person, so a family of 5 could see a double feature for a fraction of what it would cost at an indoor theater. Kids could fall asleep in the back seat. Parents could actually enjoy a movie without worrying about their children disturbing other patrons. And there was something magical about watching a film under the stars. The speaker hooked onto your car window, the smell of popcorn drifting through the warm summer air. But the 70s also brought challenges that would accelerate the decline. Rising real estate values made the large plots of land these theaters occupied increasingly valuable for development. The oil crisis made people think twice about driving anywhere they didn't absolutely need to go. And perhaps most significantly, the rise of home video at the end of the decade would fundamentally change how Americans consumed movies. There's another piece of this story though, and it connects directly to summer in the 70s. Because the 70s actually invented the summer blockbuster as we know it today. Before Steven Spielberg's Jaws opened on June 20th, 1975, summer was considered a dumping ground for movies. Studios saved their prestige pictures for the winter holiday season. Summer was for teenagers with nothing better to do. Jaws changed everything. Universal spent an unprecedented amount on television advertising. They opened the film wide, on about 400 screens simultaneously, which was massive for that era. And audiences responded in ways nobody expected. Jaws became the first film to gross over $100 million at the box office. It became a cultural phenomenon that actually kept people away from beaches. 2 years later, Star Wars arrived on May 25, 1977, and proved that Jaws wasn't a fluke. The summer blockbuster was born, and Hollywood would never be the same. In 1975, summer moviegoing accounted for only 32% of annual ticket sales. Within 2 decades, that number would nearly double. So if you went to a drive-in in the summer of 1975 or 1977, you might have been watching the very films that were reshaping American entertainment. That's something worth remembering. Let's shift to something a little more personal: the community swimming pool. In the 70s, the public pool was still a central gathering place for neighborhoods across America. This was before the massive shift toward private backyard pools and country club memberships that would reshape swimming culture in the decades to come. The routine was simple. You'd wake up, do whatever chores your parents required, and then grab your towel and head to the pool. You might walk, you might ride your bike. Either way, you'd spend hours there, from late morning until the lifeguards kicked everyone out in the evening. What happened at the pool wasn't just swimming, though swimming was part of it. There was the snack bar with its hot dogs and nachos and frozen candy bars. There was the constant social negotiation of childhood, figuring out who was friends with whom, navigating the complex hierarchies that kids establish naturally. There was Marco Polo in the shallow end, and cannonball contests off the diving board, and that one older kid who could do a perfect backflip. Now, the history of public pools in America is complicated, and it's important to acknowledge that. For much of the 20th century, access to municipal pools was restricted along racial lines. The desegregation of pools in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s was often met with resistance, and in some communities, public pools were closed entirely rather than integrated. The decline of public pools that accelerated through the 70s and 80s has roots in that painful history. Private swim clubs multiplied rapidly during this period. One study found that the number of private clubs grew from roughly 1,200 in 1952 to more than 23,000 by the mid-60s. As budget deficits hit cities and suburbs expanded, many public pools closed or fell into disrepair. What had been a shared community resource increasingly became something only certain families could access. For those of us lucky enough to have a public pool in our neighborhood during the 70s, those summers left permanent impressions. The smell of chlorine still takes many of us right back to those days. There's a reason for that. Those pools weren't just places to cool off. They were where community happened. Now I need to talk about something that's going to make younger viewers shake their heads in disbelief. The toys we played with in the 70s. Let's start with lawn darts, Jarts as they were called. These were exactly what they sound like. Large darts, about 12 inches long, with weighted metal tips designed to stick into the ground. You threw them underhand toward a target ring, like a combination of horseshoes and darts. The problem, of course, was that these weighted metal spikes didn't always land where you intended, and when they didn't, the results could be catastrophic. Between 1980 and 1988, over 6,000 Americans visited emergency rooms for lawn dart injuries. 81% of those injured were 15 or younger. Half were under 10. In 1970, the FDA classified them as a mechanical hazard and required warning labels. They were moved out of toy departments and into sporting goods sections, but they remained legal to sell, and families kept buying them. The game was genuinely fun, after all, and most people figured that with proper supervision, everything would be fine. It took multiple deaths and devastating injuries before an outright ban finally came in 1988. But throughout the 70s, these metal missiles were a fixture of backyard barbecues and 4th of July celebrations. If you grew up in that era, you probably threw them. You probably had a few close calls, and you probably didn't think twice about it at the time. The same was true for the slip and slide, though the dangers there were different. Whammo introduced it in 1961, and by the 70s, it was a summer staple. A long plastic sheet, a garden hose, and the simple joy of sliding on your belly across wet plastic. What could go wrong? Plenty, it turned out. Spinal cord injuries, neck injuries, kids hitting trees or fences or the metal stakes that held the slide in place. Adults were particularly at risk because their greater size and speed meant harder impacts. But here's the thing, we did all of this. The lawn darts, the slip and slides, riding bikes without helmets, building ramps in the driveway and trying to jump them on our Stingrays like we were Evel Knievel. We got scraped up and bruised and occasionally broken. And then we went back outside and did it again. I'm not saying this was better, I'm not romanticizing injuries. But there was something different about the way risk was understood and accepted back then. Kids were expected to learn their limits by testing them, sometimes painfully. That philosophy has largely disappeared, and there are good reasons for its decline. But it's part of what made 70s summers feel the way they did. For most American families in the 70s, the highlight of summer was the family vacation. And overwhelmingly, that meant one thing: piling into the station wagon and hitting the road. The station wagon was the family vehicle of the era. Before minivans took over in the 80s and SUVs dominated after that, the wood-paneled wagons ruled suburban driveways. Ford Country Squires, Chevy Caprice Estates, Oldsmobile Vista Cruisers, Buick Estate wagons. These land yachts could seat up to 9 passengers when equipped with the rear-facing third-row seat, and they had cavernous cargo areas for luggage, coolers, and camping gear. Between the 1950s and the mid-70s, station wagons were at their peak popularity. Then sales declined as fuel economy became more important and tastes shifted. But during the heart of the 70s, these vehicles carried countless families down the newly completed interstate highway system toward national parks, beaches, and roadside attractions. The family road trip had become embedded in American culture after World War II. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized construction of the interstate system, and over the following decades, those highways knit the country together in new ways. By the 70s, you could drive coast to coast on modern highways, stopping at Howard Johnson's restaurants and Holiday Inns along the way. The routines were familiar. Waking before dawn to beat traffic, the cooler packed with sandwiches and drinks, the arguments over which radio station to listen to, the license plate game, the eternal question from the back seat, are we there yet? Kids sprawled across the cargo area, no seatbelts required, reading comics or napping as the miles rolled by. According to the Saturday Evening Post, Americans logged 14.4 trillion highway miles during the 1970s alone. Despite the economic struggles of the decade, families kept taking vacations, even if those vacations were shorter or closer to home than they might have been in better times. And speaking of the economic situation, we should acknowledge it. The 70s were tough. Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the oil crisis, rising unemployment. The divorce rate doubled between 1965 and 1975. There were genuine reasons people wanted to escape, even if only for a couple weeks each summer. The road trip offered that escape. I want to focus now on one particular summer that stands out from the decade, the summer of 1976. On July 4th, 1976, Operation Sail brought tall ships from around the world to New York Harbor in one of the most spectacular maritime gatherings ever assembled. Queen Elizabeth II visited the United States and presented the Bicentennial Bell, cast at the same foundry as the original Liberty Bell, inscribed with the words, "For the people of the United States of America from the people of Britain, let freedom ring." In communities everywhere, people organized parades, fireworks displays, historical reenactments, and festivals. Families painted mailboxes with patriotic symbols. Fire hydrants became folk art canvases in towns across America. Commemorative coins and stamps were released. Everything seemed to be decorated in red, white, and blue. At Disneyland and Walt Disney World, a massive parade called America on Parade ran twice daily from June 1975 through September 1976, celebrating American history and culture with nightly fireworks. The timing mattered too. After the national trauma of Vietnam and Watergate, after the resignation of a president and the fall of Saigon, the Bicentennial offered a chance for healing. President Gerald Ford emphasized themes of renewal and restoration of traditional values. People needed something to feel good about, and 200 years of nationhood provided that opportunity. If you were a kid during that summer, you remember the mood. Something felt different, special. The adults seemed more unified than usual, at least for those few weeks. The fireworks seemed bigger, the parades longer, the gatherings more meaningful. So, why do we miss it? Why do those 70s summers stick with us the way they do? Part of it is simply the nature of memory and aging. Our childhoods always glow with a certain warmth when viewed from decades later. The difficulties fade while the joys remain vivid. But I think there's more to it than that. Something genuinely changed about how American children experience summer, and that change accelerated rapidly in the decades after the 70s ended. Consider the basic structure. In the 70s, summer was largely unscheduled time. Today, many kids move from school directly into organized camps, sports leagues, academic programs, and other adult-supervised activities. The empty hours that we filled with our own invention have become rare. Technology plays a role too, obviously. We had television, but only a handful of channels, and daytime programming was mostly soap operas and game shows that held little appeal for children. There were no video games to speak of until the very end of the decade, and even then, they were primitive. The outdoors was genuinely more appealing than anything inside. The perceived safety of neighborhoods changed as well. Whether crime actually increased or just seemed to, parents became more protective. Stranger danger entered the vocabulary. Free-range childhood gave way to supervised childhood, with specific drop-offs and pickups and structured activities. None of this is unique to the 70s, of course. Every generation looks back at its youth with some mixture of fondness and bewilderment at how different things have become. Our grandparents probably felt the same about their own childhoods. But here's what I keep coming back to. Those summers taught us something that scheduled summers cannot. They taught us how to handle boredom, how to invent our own entertainment, how to negotiate with other kids without adult intervention, how to take risks and face consequences, how to exist in our own bodies and our own imaginations for hours at a time. The smell of cut grass and chlorine, the distant sound of an ice cream truck, the feel of hot pavement under bare feet, the freedom of getting on your bike and just going, no destination in mind, no adult knowing exactly where you were, the gathering of neighborhood kids for games that evolved and mutated based on who showed up, the long twilights catching fireflies and not wanting the day to end. These experiences weren't unique to the 70s. But if you lived them during that decade, they're embedded in who you became. And watching childhood transform so completely in the years since, it's natural to wonder what's been lost, along with what's been gained. The good humor trucks are mostly gone now, though the brand lives on in grocery stores. Drive-in theaters number only a few hundred nationwide, novelties rather than mainstream entertainment. Public pools have declined while private ones have multiplied. The station wagon evolved into the minivan and then the SUV. The dangerous toys were banned, rightfully. The freedom we enjoyed has been replaced by structures we built for our own children. Summer still happens, of course. Kids still get out of school and have weeks stretching before them, but the texture of that time has changed fundamentally. So, when we say we miss summer in the 70s, we're not just being nostalgic about a decade. We're recognizing that a particular way of growing up, one that Americans took for granted for generations, reached something like its peak during those years and then began to fade. The 70s weren't perfect. Nothing is. The decade had real problems, and some of the things we miss probably needed to change. But that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge what was lost along with what was gained. If you were there, those summers remain vivid. The heat, the freedom, the endless days that somehow never felt long enough, the sense that anything was possible if you just got on your bike and went looking for it. That's why we miss it, not because we want to go back, but because we're glad we experienced it, and we want the people who weren't there to understand what it meant.